The rain coming off Young's Bay didn't fall. It drove. It came in low sheets from the northwest, cold enough to feel like a series of flat, deliberate slaps against any exposed skin, and it had been doing exactly that for 9 hours straight. Petty Officer Second Class Tori Bassett had stopped feeling her left hand sometime around midnight. She noticed this the way you notice a light burned out in a room you don't use much, only because she needed that hand, pressed flat against the wet flank of a 68-pound Belgian Malinois who was no longer shivering. That was the part that scared her. The shivering had stopped. Riot lay wedged between Tori and the corrugated aluminum wall of a bait shop on the outskirts of Astoria, Oregon. His dark muzzle resting on the cracked asphalt, his amber eyes open but focused on something she couldn't see. He had been making a low, intermittent sound for the past hour. Not quite a whimper, not quite a groan. Something in between that lived in a register Tori felt in her sternum more than she heard with her ears. She recognized it. She'd heard it once before, in a field hospital tent at Al-Tanf Garrison in southeastern Syria, when a trauma nurse had told her quietly that the Marine 2 cots over wasn't going to make it through the night. She pulled Riot's head into her lap and wrapped both arms around his torso, her chin dropping to the top of his skull. "Come on, buddy," she said. Her voice barely cleared a whisper, and it cracked on the second word. "You don't get to do this, not here." Riot's ear, the right one, the one that still worked, swiveled faintly toward her voice. That was something. Tori Bassett was 29 years old. She had qualified on the HK 416 at 22, completed the Navy's military working dog handler program at 23, and deployed twice to Syria with Joint Special Operations Command's K9 element before most of her college friends had finished paying off their car loans. She had been cited for valor under fire, recommended for early advancement, and described by her commanding officer as one of the most composed handlers in the program's recent history. She was also, according to the United States government, a fugitive. 11 months. That was how long they had been running, through 4 states, 2 border crossings, and more Greyhound bus stations than she could count. 11 months of paying for everything in cash. She earned cleaning fish at processing plants and hauling crab pots in the grey pre-dawn dark. 11 months of keeping Riot's vest tucked into the bottom of a military duffel, buying dog food in bulk at feed stores outside small towns, sleeping with one eye open. To anyone who read the NCIS bulletin, Tori Bassett had stolen government property and gone AWOL 11 months ago from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. The property in question, one military working dog, K9 designator R19, Belgian Malinois, male, 4 years old, combat ineffective following injuries sustained in the line of duty. To Tori, the property in question had a name, and he was dying in her arms on a rain-soaked dock in Oregon. The whole thing had started with an explosion she hadn't heard coming. The compound raid outside Deir ez-Zor had been a 20-minute operation, quick, hard, and quiet, the way those things were supposed to go. Tori and Riot had been on point, working the building's interior while 2 SEAL teams held the perimeter. Riot had found the target room fast, but then he'd done something strange in the hallway just outside it. He'd veered sharply left, pressing his body against the far wall with a sudden, focused rigidity that Tori knew meant danger. She'd barely gotten her hand signal out before the floor inside the target room came apart. The IED had been buried under the floorboards. Whoever had laid it hadn't been expecting a dog. Riot had moved first, throwing himself across the threshold as the detonation wave rolled outward. Tori had hit the wall and gone down hard. Riot had caught the worst of it. A steel fragment the size of a poker chip had opened a 4-inch gash in his right shoulder, and the concussion had permanently destroyed the hearing in his left ear. He was on his feet 30 seconds later, nosing at Tori's face with a frantic urgency she would remember for the rest of her life. She'd woken up in the medical tent with 2 cracked ribs, a grade 2 concussion, and a lot of ringing in her ears. The man at her bedside had not been a doctor. Colonel Stanton Greer ran logistics for the Joint Task Force, a pinched, precise man with silver-framed glasses and the practiced distance of someone who had spent his entire career treating human beings as budget line items. He broke the news about Riot with the same flat delivery he used for supply inventory updates. K9 R19 has been assessed as combat ineffective, he said. Permanent hearing loss in one ear, soft tissue damage to the right shoulder that's compromised his detection reliability. He can't clear a room safely. He's been reclassified. Tori had asked what that meant. Greer had told her. Scheduled humane euthanasia, 48 hours. She could apply to adopt through the military working dog program, he added, but Riot's behavioral records from the head trauma made him a liability for civilian placement. The waiver would be denied. He had said it like he was reading from a form he'd already filed. She had appealed 3 times. She'd gone to the task force JAG officer. She'd called her congressman's office from a borrowed satellite phone. 48 hours became 36. She stopped appealing and started planning. The night before the scheduled euthanasia, Tori had taken Riot from the veterinary holding kennel, removed his tracking chip with a field knife and shaking hands, and walked off the base into the dark. She'd made it to the Turkish border with the help of a civilian relief worker who asked no questions in exchange for a set of high-quality night optics she'd been issued and never returned. They'd been running ever since. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the raid on that compound in Deir ez-Zor had gone sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the IED. In the chaos of the evacuation, while she'd been unconscious and Riot had been trying to get to her, the dog had done exactly what he'd been trained to do since his 2nd week at Lackland. He'd found something small, cylindrical, and foreign-smelling near the target room floor, and in the middle of a hot exfil with gunfire coming from the eastern wall, he had swallowed it. He'd done it right. That was the terrible irony of the whole thing. He'd been trained to retrieve small objects in hostile environments by swallowing them rather than risk dropping them under fire. Find, secure, protect, drilled into him until it was pure reflex. He had no way of knowing that the object he'd secured was a Class O titanium data capsule, or that the encrypted drive inside it contained 3 years of financial records for a black market weapons diversion network routing seized military ordnance to 3 different factions across the Levant, or that the man running that network was Colonel Stanton Greer. Greer had found the capsule missing from the target room during the forensic sweep. He'd reviewed the helmet cam footage from the raid for 6 hours, watching every angle until he found the moment, barely 3 seconds of blurry low-light video, when Riot had bent his head to the floor near the door and come back up swallowing. Greer had understood immediately what that training behavior meant. The capsule was inside the dog. The euthanasia order had never been about the injury. When Tori had carried Riot off that base, she hadn't stolen a broken dog. She had walked off with the only piece of evidence capable of putting Colonel Stanton Greer in a federal penitentiary for what remained of his natural life, and Greer had been hunting her ever since. The bait shop's single security light buzzed and flickered in the rain. Tori heard heavy footsteps before she saw anything. Slow, deliberate, the tap of a rubber-tipped cane mixing with the rhythm of the downpour. Her hand moved instinctively to the fixed blade at her hip. The man who stopped in front of her was old. Not just old, ancient in the way of certain coastal things, carved down by decades of salt air and weather to something hard and lean and permanent. He was somewhere north of 80, narrow in a yellow oilskin jacket and rubber boots, with a face like weathered teak and eyes the exact grey of the bay behind him. He leaned on his cane and looked at Riot with the expression of someone who had seen a great many things in his life and was making a quick, accurate assessment of one more. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he crouched, carefully, with the deliberate articulation of someone managing old knees, and examined Riot's chest harness with the focused attention of a man who knew precisely what he was looking at. "That's a Navy-issued K9 handler vest," he said. His voice was raspy but precise, still carrying the particular cadence of someone who had spent decades both giving and receiving orders. Late generation. "And that dog is in serious distress." He looked up at Tori. "You're a handler, and you're not supposed to have him." Tori's grip tightened on the blade handle. "Keep walking," she said. He didn't. "My name is Frank Alderman," he said. "My late wife was Rear Admiral Catherine Alderman. She spent 31 years in the Navy before she retired, and the last 2 years of her life working on something that I believe has a great deal to do with why you're sitting in the rain outside a bait shop on a Tuesday night, trying to keep that dog alive." He straightened slowly. "My house is 4 blocks up the bluff. There's a fire, there's food, and there's a man inside who has been a veterinary surgeon for longer than you've been alive." He looked at Riot one final time. "If you wait until morning, you won't have a decision left to make." He turned and started walking up the hill, his cane tapping against the wet road. He did not look back. Riot's working ear turned. His amber eyes tracked the old man's retreating shape with a slow, deliberate focus. Tori looked at the dog. The dog looked at the hill. She picked him up. The house on Clatsop Ridge had been built in 1908, and it wore its age the way the man who lived in it did, without apology, with a quiet authority that suggested whatever storms had come before hadn't done much lasting damage. 3 stories of dark-stained cedar shingles behind a low stone wall, its windows throwing warm amber light out into the rain, the kind of house that looked like it had been standing long enough to belong to the ground beneath it. Frank held the door. Tori carried Riot across the threshold. The entry hall smelled of wood smoke and something savory from the back of the house, and the warmth hit her like a pressure change. Riot's breathing shifted almost immediately, something in the deep, involuntary way of an animal finally allowing itself to acknowledge warmth after too long without it. Tori's eyes stung. "Parlor," Frank said. "There's a rug by the fireplace. Not too close. Let him warm gradually." She lowered Riot onto a braided wool rug in front of a stone fireplace where a log fire had clearly been burning for hours. The dog exhaled, a long, shuddering release, and settled, his eyes still tracking Tori's face. The room's walls held her attention as Frank disappeared down the hallway. Photographs covered them, but not the decorative kind, framed and purposeful, a visual record of a specific kind of life. A woman in dress whites, receiving a citation from a uniformed general. Shadow boxes with medals, a Navy cross, campaign ribbons. A photograph of an aircraft carrier taken from a deck-level angle. One photograph stopped Tori cold. In it, the same woman stood at a podium in what appeared to be a Pentagon conference room, a projected slide visible behind her. The slide bore a header, Armed Forces Military Working Dog Program, Disposition Review, Fiscal Year Reform. Rear Admiral Catherine Alderman. Frank returned carrying a tray. Behind him came a man Tori hadn't heard enter, compact, late 60s, wearing a thick flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, carrying a portable medical kit that had clearly seen serious use. "Dr. Colm Rafferty," Frank said, setting the tray down, 30 years as a military veterinary surgeon, chief of surgery at Camp Pendleton for the last 12 of them. He retired here 4 years ago. He owes Catherine a debt that's never been settled, and he's been waiting for a reason to settle it. He turned to Riot. "Feed the dog first." "Small amounts. He hasn't eaten properly in days." He was right. Tori took the shallow bowl of soft-cooked chicken from the tray with shaking hands and fed Riot from her palm, one careful piece at a time, watching the dog's amber eyes sharpen with each swallow. Dr. Rafferty crouched beside her, running practiced hands along Riot's flank, his expression concentrated and still. When Riot had eaten enough and gone quiet with his chin on Tori's knee, she reached for the mug of coffee on the tray. Her hands were still shaking. "You knew my name before I told you," she said. Frank settled into the armchair across from her. He had the quality of stillness that very old, very deliberate people sometimes develop, the kind that suggested the room reorganized itself slightly around him when he sat down. "I've known about you for 8 months," he said, "and about K9R19. I've been waiting." He paused, waiting for Catherine's case to find its way back to me. Tori set the mug down carefully. Frank leaned forward and put his hands on his knees. His grey eyes held hers with a steadiness that reminded her, with an almost physical jolt, of the look on her first commanding officer's face the day he'd told her she'd passed selection. "Catherine didn't retire," he said. "She was pushed out. 3 years ago, she was building a case against a network of senior logistics officers who had been diverting seized weapons and equipment into a secondary black market operation, selling back into the same conflict zones we were trying to stabilize, routing the proceeds through offshore shell accounts. She had names. She had transaction records. She was 2 weeks from presenting her findings to the Inspector General when she went off a coastal highway on a clear night in November. No weather, no mechanical failure, no skid marks. The fire snapped, the clock on the mantel ticked. She had one gap in her evidence," Frank continued, "the financial ledger. The record that tied every account in the network together. She knew the data existed on an encrypted drive, she just couldn't locate it. And then the raid in Deir ez-Zor happened, and the drive disappeared, and 8 months ago I started picking up signals that a routine NCIS bulletin had been escalated to something with a clearance ceiling far above any standard AWOL case." He looked at Riot. "That's when I understood where the drive had gone." Tori felt something in the center of her chest go very cold and very still. "Riot swallowed it," she said. "Not a question, more like something clicking shut." The capsule he retrieved in the compound was a Class 4 titanium field container, Frank said. "Waterproof, acid-resistant, designed for deep field intelligence recovery. It cannot be digested, it cannot pass naturally. It has been lodged in that dog's upper intestinal tract for 11 months. She looked at Dr. Rafferty. He had stopped examining Riot. He was watching her face. "The symptoms you've been attributing to his shoulder injury and the malnutrition," Rafferty used, his voice low and careful. "The weight loss that doesn't respond to feeding. The intermittent fever. The abdominal tenderness that keeps coming back." He paused. "It's a toxic blockage. The capsule housing is creating a slow chemical reaction with his intestinal lining. If it stays there much longer, his organs will begin to fail." The full weight of it settled over Tori the way bad news always does when your mind keeps trying to push it away, in stages, each one a little heavier than the last. She had thought she was saving him. 11 months of running, of going hungry herself to keep him fed, of sleeping in culverts and ferry terminals and the back seats of borrowed cars, all of it to protect him from a needle in a kennel on a military base. He'd been carrying a needle inside him the whole time. "We need to operate," she said. "Tonight," Rafferty said. "I have a sterile setup in the basement, but his weight and heart rate are going to make anesthesia a serious risk. I want to be honest with you about that." Tori looked down at Riot. He was watching her face. He had always watched her face. It had been one of the first things she'd noticed during their pairing assessment at Lackland. The way he tracked her expression with a focused attention that felt less like animal instinct and more like a continuous, deliberate choice. "He threw himself in front of an IED for me," she said. "I'm not going to let him die in the basement because anesthesia is hard." Frank stood. "Before you go downstairs," he said, "I want you to see something." He crossed to the sideboard beneath the largest photograph and opened the bottom drawer, removing a manila envelope sealed with red evidence tape. He set it on the coffee table between them. Catherine had a contact inside the task force who kept feeding her information after she was forced out. That contact retired last year and came here. She brought this. He nodded at the envelope. "Open it." Tori broke the seal and pulled out the sheaf of documents inside. Classified routing records, heavily redacted but legible where it mattered. Dates, transaction amounts, account numbers traced to shell corporations registered in 3 different countries, covering memos with Colonel Stanton Greer's signature block at the bottom. An internal investigation request that had been filed and quietly buried by the same office that received it. And a personnel file. Greer's, his postings, evaluations, operational assignments. A paper-clipped psychological assessment from a military medical officer, flagged and then unflagged, buried in the administrative record. At the bottom of the last page, in a woman's precise handwriting, "He knows, will not act, archive and watch." The drive inside Riot contains the financial ledger that proves every line of this, Frank said. Without it, these documents are circumstantial. With it, Stanton Greer spends the rest of his life in Leavenworth. He held her gaze, and the man he sent to make sure that never happens checked into the motel at the base of the ridge 2 hours before I found you. Tori looked up from the pages. He came in a rental car with Virginia plates, Frank said. Paid cash. He's been monitoring the background check systems at processing plants across 3 states. That's how he tracked you here. He knows you're in Astoria. He'll have found the bait shop by now, and when he finds it empty, he'll start working outward from there. His voice did not change. We have a narrow window. Tori was already on her feet. Get Riot downstairs, she said. The basement was cold and brilliant under surgical lamps. Rafferty had clearly spent considerable time setting up with care a stainless steel table, a heart monitor, IV lines laid out in sequence on a sterile field. It looked like the real thing because it was. Rafferty worked the IV line into Riot's foreleg with the efficiency of 30 years of practice. Riot submitted with only a faint trembling, his eyes still on Tori. You need to step outside, Rafferty said. I need the room. Tori leaned down and pressed her forehead against Riot's. His warm breath moved against her cheek in a long, slow exhale. I'll be right on the other side of that door, she said. You know the protocol. Wait for me. She went up the cellar stairs and into the kitchen and stood in the dark. The house was very quiet, rain against the windows, the grandfather clock in the hallway, the deep, intermittent creak of old timbers settling. Then the conservatory window gave. It wasn't loud, a precise professional application of force, the kind that comes from specific training in entry technique, rather than someone simply forcing their way through a house. Glass settling, not shattering, the compressed wet footfall of a boot on a wooden floor. She found Frank in the hallway. He was standing in the dark with a flatness she recognized, the controlled calm that belongs to people who have been in dangerous situations before and understand that panic is a choice. In his right hand he held a Beretta M9 with a steadiness that his age did nothing to diminish. She almost said something. Instead, she pointed him toward the deep alcove beneath the staircase and put her hand briefly on his arm. That door to the basement stays covered, she said quietly. Nothing reaches it. He looked at her for a moment, then he moved. Tori went to work. She had the layout in her head from her entry walk-through. Parlor left, conservatory right, long hallway connecting to the kitchen at the rear. The intruder had come through the conservatory, east side of the house. He'd scouted from the ridge approach and taken the blind corner. Professional, but still orienting. She moved through the kitchen without sound, placing her feet heel to ball the way she'd been taught, weight transferred, no strike. She unclipped the heavy flashlight from her belt, not to use as a light. In the hallway she heard him, moving well, using the right technique, but adapting to the layout as he went rather than knowing it cold. She could tell by the quarter-second hesitations at each corner. He was good, he just hadn't been inside this house before tonight. She had. She let him reach the parlor threshold. The fire had burned down to embers, throwing almost no light, but from the narrow slant of ambient glow through the staircase skylight, she caught the silhouette of the weapon in his hands, a suppressed short-barrel rifle leveled at the room's center, a monocular thermal optic on a head mount. 2 seconds and he'd have her. She was already moving. She came in hard from the left side, swinging the flashlight at the thermal mount with the specific angle she'd been drilled on for kinetic strikes against head-mounted optics. The impact was solid. The mount cracked away from its rail, the optics spinning off into the dark, and the intruder was blind in a pitch-black room. He recovered fast. She gave him that without hesitation. He pivoted toward her, leading with the suppressed muzzle, without hesitating for even a beat. She dropped under it, driving her elbow into his solar plexus, with 11 months of everything she'd been carrying. He grunted, and the muzzle swept upward. 3 suppressed rounds punched through the parlor ceiling. They went to the floor together, crashing through the edge of the coffee table. He was heavier and fresher, and she felt it immediately. His knee found her hip and levered her sideways, and when she locked onto his weapon arm, he released the rifle entirely, and came up with a fixed blade that she barely caught before it reached her throat. Her forearm was burning. She could feel the edge catching. She heard his breathing, controlled, trained, but finite, and she knew what 11 months of cold and hunger and concrete floors had taken from her, that she couldn't recover in this room, at this moment with this man. She could feel the deficit in her arms. Then she heard a single decisive double click. The hammer of a Beretta M9 cocked with purpose. The intruder heard it too. In the dark, he went completely still. "Release." Frank Alderman's voice came from the staircase alcove, entirely steady. "I have the geometry. Don't test it." 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then the hand holding the blade opened. Tori took the knife, rolled clear, and had the man secured in 4 seconds. Frank turned on the parlor lamp with the hand that wasn't holding the Beretta. His face in the yellow light was unreadable, the particular stillness of someone who had already processed what just happened and moved forward to what came next. Before either of them spoke, the intercom on the parlor wall crackled. Rafferty's voice came through it, tight with exhaustion, and something underneath that took Tori a half-second to identify as relief. "Tori," a pause and then a long exhale. "Surgery's done. We have the capsule. He's in recovery." Another pause, shorter. "His vitals are stable. He's going to be all right." Tori sat down on the parlor floor, just sat down where she was, and pressed both hands flat against the old boards because she needed to feel something solid and real. She was aware of Frank watching her from across the room. She was aware that she was crying. She didn't do anything about either one. 72 hours later, an encrypted packet was transmitted simultaneously to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and 2 federal courts with active sealed warrants. The packet contained the decrypted contents of the titanium capsule. Riot had carried inside him for 11 months, 460 pages of financial records, transaction logs, and operational communications, documenting 3 years of weapons diversion, embezzlement of seized military assets, and a coordinated effort to obstruct a flag officer's investigation. Colonel Stanton Greer was arrested by federal agents at his desk in the Pentagon on a Tuesday afternoon. He was escorted out, still holding a coffee cup. He was charged with treason, conspiracy to commit murder. The investigation into Rear Admiral Catherine Alderman's highway accident had been reopened 48 hours prior, and 7 additional federal counts. His sentencing took place in a courtroom open to the public. 45 years, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The presidential pardon for Tori Bassett came through 6 weeks after the arrest. Her honorable discharge was reinstated with full back pay and medical benefits. The NCIS bulletin bearing her photograph was scrubbed from every database it had reached. She received notification of all of it by certified mail on a Wednesday morning, standing in Frank Alderman's kitchen in a borrowed flannel shirt, drinking hot coffee she'd made herself. She cared about one document. She read it standing in the parlor, the fire going behind her, Riot stretched across the braided wool rug, with a new orthopedic wrap on his right shoulder, and the particular contentment of a dog who has recently eaten a large bowl of something he thoroughly approved of. Legal transfer and permanent retirement of military working dog K9 designator R19 to handler Petty Officer 2nd Class Victoria A. Bassett, USNR. 3 signatures, 1 seal, 2 pages. She read it twice, then she folded it once and held it against her sternum, looking out the window at the grey morning coming in off the Pacific. "There are things of Catherine's I thought you should have," Frank said. He'd come in quietly behind her. He moved quietly for a man his age. She'd noticed that from the first night. He set a cardboard box on the table. Riot's full service records, his training citations, a photograph taken by another handler at Lackland on the day Riot had passed his final K9 certification. She looked young in the photograph. She had been young in it. "Where are you going to go?" Frank asked. She looked at the box. She looked at the dog. She looked at the grey water past the window. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true, and for the first time in 11 months, it was the kind of true that felt like open ground rather than a wall. Frank came to stand beside her at the window, his hands folded on the head of his cane, his gaze going out to the water. "Catherine always said this house was too big for the arguments inside it," he said after a moment. "She meant it as a complaint. I've come to understand it differently." He glanced down at Riot, who had relocated himself from the rug to the floor directly in front of the fireplace, occupying the warmest square foot in the room with the authority of a dog who has decided a place suits him. "Rafferty comes twice a week for the shoulder. He stays for dinner, which means someone has to cook. That's a thing I'm no longer as competent at as I once was." Tori looked at the old man beside her. He was watching the water with an expression she recognized. The particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have lost someone they expected to grow old beside, who have learned to look at ordinary things with a gratitude that cannot be separated from grief. She thought about 11 months of bus station floors. She thought about the document folded against her chest. She thought about Riot's ear swiveling toward her voice in the dark under a bait shop, Eve, the small involuntary movement of a living thing choosing, even at its absolute limit, to stay oriented toward the one it trusted. "I'm a decent cook," she said. Frank said nothing, but the line of his shoulders changed, barely, just enough to see, and when he looked over at her, there was something in those grey eyes that hadn't been there the night she'd carried Riot through his front door. "Good," he said, "then you know where the kitchen is." Riot's tail moved twice against the floor, slow and deliberate, the way it always did when he understood that wherever they had landed, they were not leaving. Tori set the box down beside Catherine Alderman's photograph, let out a long breath and stayed.